Thom Powers, Artistic Director of the Doc NYC Festival and your host for today's Half Hour with Disclosure. The film Disclosure had its world premiere at the Sundance Film Festival in January, then came to Netflix in the summer, and it was recently nominated for an IDA Editing Award. I'm pleased to be joined by the film's director, Sam Feder.
Hi, Tom.
Great to be with you again.
Nice to see you.
Before we get started with our conversation, we've got a clip from the film, so let's watch that.
I think one of the first trans representations I saw in a fictional context was that episode of The Jeffersons with Edie Stokes.
It's me, Eddie. Only I'm Edie now. Take a good look.
She was beautiful and elegant and black. But then also there was the character that George hired to say that he was Edie, to sort of let Wheezy know that he wasn't cheating. That representation felt like it existed as a joke and the same bullying that I was experiencing at school.
All right, so that clip gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of media analysis that this film brings, and also the voices of so many trans actors and actresses like Laverne Cox, who we hear there. She's also an executive producer on this film. Let me begin with Laverne Cox because there was a report just a couple days ago that she was the victim of a transphobic attack in Los Angeles with a friend targeted in a park that really brings home the violence behind hateful images. I wonder if you can, give further context to the transphobic violence that goes underreported.
Yeah, thank you for starting with that. I appreciate that. Laverne was just going out on a walk, the simple pleasures of COVID life. And she was with a friend in Griffith Park. And a gentleman passed by and asked if, man or woman, boy or girl. And her friend was just kind of just gave him a F you kind of look. And the guy attacked them. And that was it, just because the guy didn't know, right? And it all circles back to this idea that we aren't who we say we are. And when we look at the history of trans representation in film and TV, every single thing points back to that, right? Whether it's that we're a joke, that we're mentally ill, that we have to reveal, the onus is on us to tell you who we really are. It's all saying we're not who we show up to be, right? And that is one step towards dehumanizing somebody. And once you dehumanize somebody, violence follows, always. That's just the nature of the world. And 80% of Americans have said they don't think they know trans people, that the only contact they've had with a trans person are those they've seen in film and TV. Right. And so when you look at the history of film and TV and you see that we have been distorted and dehumanized in every way possible, of course, violence is going to follow. So, of course, in 2020, when Laverne goes for a walk in Griffith Park, she gets attacked.
So 6 years ago, you made a film about Kate Bornstein, the great trans activist, called Kate Bornstein is a Queer and Pleasant Danger. Following that film, what led you to Disclosure?
I had been thinking about Disclosure for so long, probably decades. When I started doing photography when I was 15, it was, in New York City at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I kind of had my first photography class, and a few months later, Magic Johnson announced he was positive. And it was at that time that one of my high school mentors was a huge Magic Johnson fan. So she organized us around HIV, and I really became politicized through that and seeing how media shaped stigma around HIV and AIDS. And so I started telling these stories and really quickly started to see how the transformative possibilities around telling stories in the way we want to see, right? So then a few years later, I started making films about the trans community that I was part of. And then, 2014 sneaks up upon us, and Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. And she was the first openly trans woman to be on the cover. So that was amazing, you know, and they framed her beautifully, right? She was in this beautiful dress and she's looking defiantly down at the camera, right? So all of us know behind, you know, how you angle somebody says so much about, you know, how they're going to be perceived. So there was a lot of intention, but it did say the transgender tipping point as the headline. And that really gave me pause, because when that cover story hit the newsstands, trans people had barely been acknowledged, right? Let alone celebrated. And so I was thrilled because we need to be seen, but then I became really concerned because we know that when marginalized communities get mainstream attention, backlash ensues, right? So I was trying to reconcile this, you know, the world that I lived in, where trans people were and continue to be disproportionately underemployed, lack access to affordable housing and safe healthcare, face higher rates of hate crimes, as we just saw this last weekend. I wanted to understand how we got to this moment and where we were going, right? Disclosure shows that we have always been a site of fascination in film and TV, you know, but when you think about, you know, Yancey Ford has this great line at the end of the film where he says, we cannot be a better society until we see a better society. I cannot be in the world until I see I am in the world, right? So there was this paradox I was really trying to understand and wrestle with, right? The rise of trans visibility, the celebratory rise of it, and the rise of social and legislative violence. So I wanted to explore that paradox while showing what has led up to this point.
So I read that you kind of began your process by taking oral histories from 100 trans people working in film. What was that process like? And, you know, how much were you learning, or how much was it just affirming things you already knew?
Oh my God, I learned so much. You know, when I set out to do this film, I thought about ethnic notions and the celluloid closet, because obviously you can see the relationship between those films and Disclosure. And both of those documentaries were based on books, right? So I assumed I just needed to go out and find the trans representation book and I would make my film. Alas, didn't exist. So I then, okay, I'm going to have to document, I'm going to have to create this history for the first time. And I have to collect the data and go through hundreds of years of thousands of clips and footage, but how do I pick these, right? And I knew I couldn't do that in a vacuum. And we know that anyone who decides to tell a history, that's a very ethically precarious thing to do. So from the beginning, I knew this had to include as many trans voices as possible, like the memories, the experiences, and the perspectives of trans people. So I made a list of every trans person that I had known up to that point, who I had been in conversations with, who had worked on one side of the camera or the other. And through those conversations, you know, I did these oral histories with people across the country. That's when I collected the data. And there was, I mean, I would say like 80% was new information. I mean, there were some films that we saw that we had in common, some TV shows we both remembered, things I had completely forgot, things I'd never seen, and also ways of seeing. And that the ways of seeing is what I think like Disclosure is about. It's a new way of seeing, right? How do we understand how trans people have seen themselves in film and TV? How do we understand how non-trans people have learned to think about us, right? And then furthermore, how does a trans person find themselves in this medium that has not been very kind to us, you know? So there's those stories that, like, Laverne Cox shares that story about Yentl, which is one of my favorite stories, where she's identifying with Yentl, with the Barbara Streisand character. You know, and she tells this whole story. I don't want to ruin it. It's in the film, but it was one of those moments where that's nothing I would have ever thought of, right? Like, but little Laverne was able to project herself into this character because she couldn't find herself in a way that felt good anywhere else. Like, all the other images made her feel terrible about herself, you know? So it's a really interesting look about human psychology and how we find ourselves in order to survive, you know, in the worst of circumstances. So those are the things I learned the most. And I think that's such a beautiful takeaway that anyone who loves film and TV will take that away from this film.
You know, can you talk about who you want to be watching this film and what you want them to be getting from it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories that trans people alone need to know. And certainly this is a story trans people need to know. But I think that the reason I chose to work with film and television specifically was because that was a way to reach people who may not think this issue is relevant to them, or that they even care, right? Using a medium that people have engaged with for so long and that they remember specific scenes and clips, they can now start to realize the mark it has left on them, right? And begin to reflect on that and start to see how they've internalized that in the way they understand who trans people are in the world, right? And I think that's where we reach unlikely allies and form deeper connections with existing allies.
I mean, I think the real power of the film is that you take moments like we just saw from the Jeffersons that may have floated through our consciousness at one point or another, and maybe they stuck, maybe they didn't, maybe they, contributed to a certain kind of bias and prejudice that we were unaware of as we were taking them in. A real power of watching Disclosure is the way you distill so many of these images to really create a damning transphobic history of Hollywood. And I wonder, I think you and I spoke in June, and I asked you a version of this question, but now more time has passed and the film has been out there more. I wonder if you've heard from people in Hollywood who, were responsible for some of that damaging image making over the years. If anyone has reached out to you or anyone on your team to have a reckoning with that.
When you say those who are responsible, I would have to say no. I've had actors, reach out and apologize, and quite honestly, I don't blame the actors. Actors need to work. I think
you're thinking of cisgender actors who may have performed a transgender role.
Correct. Like there's a clip from Ally McBeal where Wilson Cruz, who I'm very fond of, plays a transgender woman, and he, on social media apologized a million times, when Disclosure was being promoted because he's a non-trans guy. But I don't blame the actors. Actors need work. I do hope now that actors won't take roles of trans people, because I think Disclosure shows that in itself does harm. But have I heard from those in power, like directors, producers? Not so much. Something that was very exciting was Ryan Reynolds. After he saw Disclosure, he posted about how it has changed the way not only that he looks at film and TV, but how he's going to make film and TV. And he knew about our production model, which I can tell you about, and that inspired him to come up with a training fellowship that he's now been promoting. So that was really cool, like to see, this A-list actor be so deeply moved and then have it change the practice, his filmmaking practice.
Well, I did want to ask you about that production model. So why don't you elaborate on that?
Right. So just like I, in the research, knew that trans people had to be the heart of the story and everyone you see on camera is trans, behind the scenes, we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't do that, we mentored a trans person, right? So I spent months on this, and it took resources and time, but it was so important that that's where we put our energy, because that so deeply informs how the story is told. Not only because how things are lit or framed, or how your makeup is done, or how you're mic'd, and how people are talking to you, but on set, often the people we were interviewing who were, working actors had never been around so many trans people before. And that in itself, when you sit down and, the lights come on and everyone gets quiet, and you would see the expression that people, our interviewees would look around and see that everyone was trans, you just relax into it more, and it becomes immediately more comfortable and organic and intimate. And so when we couldn't hire a trans person for a key role, we knew it was important that there still be a trans person who's informing that role. And something that was really powerful about that experience was our gaffer on our first shoot in January 2018. Our gaffer was a non-trans woman, queer woman, and considered herself an ally, but had never worked with trans people, certainly didn't know this history. But she was so moved after the first day that she realized that her union might not be the most welcoming place for trans people. Right? The union is called IATSE. And she immediately went back to her union and instituted the first trans sensitivity training. So, that's the invisible work that some of the work I'm most proud of, that from day one, Disclosure was having that impact on the industry.
Let me stay on that for a minute, because I feel like there are lessons to be applied for, all kinds of people who've been shut out of the film world for race, religion, disabilities, all kinds of reasons. So can you, for especially filmmakers who are watching this and who want to kind of understand better, like how you did that, or, how am I supposed to explain that to my producer or the people who are running the budget, that we, need to make certain allowances to make this happen? I mean, can you talk about the kind of nitty gritty of those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, there's like sort of like two branches of that, right? One where you're telling a story that's so specific about a community, you need to have that community fully part of that story, right? Like, and there would be times when we explained our production model that we're prioritizing hiring trans people, not only to, help expand the industry and give people more skills, but also because those are the best people to tell the story. We would often hear, well, you really need to find like the person with the best skill, right? The best camera person, the best editor, right? And that's when it was obvious, okay, trans people are the best people to tell the story. There's something about a lived experience that can't be taught, right? That can't be learned and by just hearing about it. Like, you have to live it in order to know how to then create art from it. Simultaneously, if we say we want to diversify the industry, we have no excuses not to, right? Making film, making TV is so hard. Everything is hard. So I often hear people say, well, we don't have the money, we don't have the time, people just don't exist. And we know those are all excuses, right? It's like, where is your intention? Where is the energy you're going to put? And so, we did a national search. I did interviews. I met people. I individually worked with everyone, and everyone I hired who was going to mentor, I needed them to be excited about it, right? I needed them to understand why this was important. And that was a lot easier than I thought it would be. And it just infuses the set with so much more passion and commitment. You're not only making a film, but you're building a community and you're paying it forward. And you're aware of that every day. And it's always going to improve the product.
Let me ask you about the people who are on camera. Most of these people are people who are, have careers in acting or are academics or activists, and so are almost kind of pre-selected to be a group of people who are already out in public talking about their work. But as you alluded to before, the more exposure that gets put on a minority group, the more danger arises, and the attack on Laverne Cox is an example of that. I wonder, when you were inviting people to go on camera to be the faces of this conversation, was there any hesitancy? Was there anything that kind of needed to get worked out, or were people excited for this opportunity?
All of the above. On one hand, it was so challenging. We had such a long wish list, and so many people that I wanted to, we brought in people from all over the country. Angelica Ross shows up at the end of the film, and it took us 2 years to book her because she's just in such demand. We ended up getting her 6 weeks before our Sundance premiere. So that was a thing. But everyone else, it was a combination of a lot of the people we knew already, right? Laverne and I had been in community with most of the people you see. And, we'd been in these conversations. A lot of these conversations were really organic to the relationships we'd already been existing in for so many years. Like, the access and trust was inherent, and to why we came to this project. So, but then in addition to that, I spent a lot of time talking with people, pre-interview, if you will, where it would just be about like these conversations where I'm trying to find out what they want to contribute to this history. This is their history. Like, what are the stories that are important to them? And there were some people who are new in the industry and felt like this could be a risk, and we talked about that. And, something that I've done when despite some of the pushback I get from other people, is I always tell people that if they say something on set that they regret, it's gone. I will not include it in the film. And that happens. And it happened in Disclosure. Many times people called me a week or two later and they're like, I'm not, let's not keep that in. And I get it, right? Like, you're trying to build a career and there is an honest critique of something or someone or some system, but you're worried that that's going to keep you from getting a job. And that's really unfortunate. And some of the people in our film that might seem to be in like really privileged positions were some of the people that didn't want to take those risks. So it's deep. It's deep.
Yeah. Trans people aren't a monolith. Even the differences between the experience of being trans feminine or trans masculine has different sets of issues. And I wonder how you navigated that, or you tried to take that into account?
You know, that's a good question because, you know, just simply trans men, trans women, not looking at race or class or non-binary people, if you just like reduce it to trans masculine, trans feminine, there's such different histories, right? They could be totally different films, dissertations, you know, 5-part series within themselves. But I knew I had to include both in this film, and not only because, you know, the history for trans men is so tiny. You know, we've mostly not been portrayed. Um, and there's, you know, disclosure explores that. But it was really important to me to include as many voices in the film as possible, and people needed to be talking about their own experience. You know, likewise, across race and class and age felt really important as well. And you know, the thing that I love most about being trans, one of the things I love most about being trans is that trans people exist on the intersections of every single identity a human can have, right? Again, every race, every age, every religion, every ability, any form a human being shows up in the world, there is a trans person. And that is just, you know, aside from, you know, the way we told disclosure, that's what is so exciting around the possibilities around trans storytelling, is because we're everywhere. We live and exist in every part of human experience.
Well, the generational differences is felt very profoundly, I think, in the film. Where, you know, especially when you're talking to an older generation of actors and actresses. I mean, I wonder if you can talk about some of the, you know, points of light happening today in representation on screen.
I think what's exciting today is we're seeing more and more trans people behind the scenes, right? And that's where we're going to see the most difference. Like when you see trans people in decision-making positions, that's when everything else is going to start to look better, right? So, you know, on Pose, like you talked about, you've got Silas Howard directing, you've Janet Mock writing and directing, Lady J is writing and producing. And so that's when we're starting to see exciting characters where they're human beings that happen to be trans, and their transness deeply informs the way they live in the world, but the character arc doesn't begin and end on this reductive trans narrative, on just the body or just the trans as being the butt of a joke. So we see these characters that are actually we connect to on a human level, that are not dehumanized, right? It's like we see Laverne on television. And that's why it's so impactful to know that this person that we've grown to love and admire on TV has now been attacked in the real world. Like, while that's a sad story, that is a moment of hope, right? Because people feel like they know Laverne, right? And when someone you know is now the victim of violence, it impacts you really differently, right? And so this gives me hope that we're moving the needle a little bit.
So you were making this film against a backdrop of the Trump administration, against a lot of pushback against trans rights. We are at a kind of transition moment in our politics, uncertain what that means. But I wonder what your hopes are for this moment.
I mean, in film and TV, I want to see more trans people behind the scenes. That's the easy solution to all problems in media. My hopes for this moment are that when they're connecting to these characters, are they going to think about who they're voting for, right? Are they going to wonder, like, are the people they're voting for believe that trans people deserve to be in public space, right? Deserve access to affordable housing and job protection? You know, are we going to do our part to make the world a better place for trans people? You know, Joe Biden mentioned trans people in his victory speech. And that got a lot of buzz, and that was really exciting. And I remember when he was in office before, he did say trans rights are like our next civil right revolution, something along those lines, the next big battle. So he's been talking about trans lives for a while, but there was something really poignant about him mentioning in the victory speech that felt very seamless. Like it didn't feel tagged on, like often it feels like when people are including us. You know, it felt like we had been part of the conversation, and just like people are now, you know, including gay and lesbian people when they're talking about different groups of people, now people are including trans people in a way that they hadn't before, and that's exciting. And we're up against some of the most demoralizing battles. You know, people are still challenging our access to healthcare Chase Strangio, who shows up at the end of Disclosure, works at the ACLU and is constantly, talking about, he's going to court to, give a child access to the bathroom at his school, or get a young trans girl access to healthcare, because doctors are now getting the right to refuse healthcare to trans patients. I think we just saw something where institutions are fighting for their right to discriminate against trans people, right? Because it's their freedom of speech, right? Like, it's that sort of backwards way of again, criminalizing us. So it's wonderful that Joe Biden included us in his victory speech, yet we're still up against incredible odds, and the work is just beginning.
So you've been talking about this film as a finished product since January, when it came out, when it debuted at the Sundance Film Festival. And yet it's exciting to me to know that this film exists on Netflix every day, is being constantly discovered by new audiences every day. And there's, 15-year-olds now who will discover it in 3 years when they're 18, or, it's going to keep on teaching people. And I wonder, what are the conversations that you're continuing to foster, or the ways in which the film is creating opportunities for dialogue?
We have an incredible impact campaign. We're working with impact producer, veteran Liza Licht, who was at POV for about 17 years. And she and I have actually been friends since we were 10 years old. And she's come on as our impact producer and created this incredible campaign where we're partnering with educators, we're partnering with people in the judicial system, lawyers and judges. In fact, a California judge group used clips from Disclosure to educate one another about the biases they may have about trans people coming into the courtroom. We're also doing a lot of DEI. I did a talk with Fidelity, Fidelity Banking, which was wonderful, right? And then Northwell Healthcare and Netflix, right? People know there's so much they still don't know, and we're at a time when people want to do better, and people's hearts are open, and they want to learn what they don't know, and they want to relearn how to be more inclusive of trans people. We have events. I think we've done over 150 events aside from Netflix, partnering with our organizations. We have over 50 organizations. So that we're going to be doing for as long as possible. And that's very exciting.
So as we wrap this up, what is next for you? I mean, it seems like you could make a full-time job out of just doing those kinds of consultations, but is there another film project that on your horizon?
It has been a full-time job, and I love it, and I am getting ready to move on. Yes, I'm working with Gersh. One wonderful thing to come out of this experience this summer was that I signed with an agent, and they've been bringing me film and TV shows to look at, and a few have piqued my interest, and some I'm pursuing, which is really cool.
Well, if anyone hasn't seen Disclosure yet, I hope this conversation sends you to Netflix to watch it. Sam Fader, thank you very much for taking the time.